Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name's Alyson Klein, and I'm a reporter for Education Week, where I cover federal policy and the Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSA, which passed back in 2015, when things could still be done in a bipartisan way, told states that they had to look beyond test scores, engaging student achievement, and they needed to incorporate new measures of school quality and student success in their accountability systems. So states ended up choosing a wide range of options. Illinois, for instance, is eventually going to measure fine arts education. I feel like if you had looked at my childhood drawings and tried to show progress in fine arts, that wouldn't work well, but I'm curious to see what they'll be doing. Connecticut is measuring access to arts education classes. District of Columbia is looking at re-enrollment, meaning the percentage of kids that decide to return to a particular school. California will look at discipline. Maryland is looking at access to a well-rounded curriculum. But as you've heard from our first two speakers, by far the two most popular measures are chronic absenteeism or attendance and college and career readiness. As you've heard, at least 36 states are looking at chronic absenteeism, and at least 35 are looking at college and career readiness. And as you've heard, states are defining that in many different ways, from AP course taking to dual enrollment to career certification to military readiness. So will these new measures help states and districts get away from thinking about just test scores and really considering these other factors in day-to-day learning? Will measuring things like chronic absenteeism or discipline disparities motivate policymakers to do something to combat those problems? And what can states, districts, schools, communities, parents do about these issues that these measures, do about issues and inequities that looking at these measures uncover? With us to unpack these tricky questions, we have a great panel. Scott Brabrand is the superintendent of Fairfax County Schools. Ajit Gopalakrishnan is the chief performance officer at the State Department of Education in Connecticut. Sandra Diodonet is the assistant superintendent of the Paterson School District in New Jersey. Broderick Johnson is the chair of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. And Javaid Siddiqi is the president and CEO of the Hunt Institute. You all probably noticed you have note cards over on your chairs. So if a question occurs to you as these folks are talking, feel free to jot it on the note card. Someone will be around to collect those, and then that's how we're going to handle Q&A. So I'll be reading from note cards at the end instead of folks getting up. But first, I'm going to ask each of these folks a question, and they'll give some framing remarks. First question is for Javaid. Javaid, how can policymakers strike the right balance in messaging around the importance of these new measures around school quality and student success, while also emphasizing the importance of student achievement and growth?
Well, thank you for the question. And let's give Alyson a round of applause for just getting our names correct. And thank you to Ann and Jay and the Brookings and Bush folks for inviting us. So at the Hunt Institute, we work with elected officials from all over the country, governor's office. We work with senior elected, sort of aspiring governors, and we work very intimately with three state legislatures, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina. And so I had a chance on behalf of the Hunt Institute to participate in the Bellwether ESSA reviews. So it was a really interesting sort of cross-section because I actually had a chance to review some of these plans and also have it sort of bring it this policy lens. Unfortunately, while we have a very unique opportunity, it's an unprecedented opportunity with the ESSA law for states to really lead. This has been clamoring for the autonomy. School district leaders have been clamoring and asking and begging. And finally, we have an opportunity to embrace this autonomy. What should be of concern, though, with our policymakers is 36 states chronic absenteeism. I don't want to confuse this number. 36 gubernatorial elections coming up this fall. And so there's a lot of plans that have been written, and there's some new administrations coming down the pike that necessarily don't own those plans. They don't identify with those plans. The nice thing about ESSA, unlike NCLB, ESSA is necessarily not written in stone. So these state leaders will be campaigning, and will be making some pitches to their communities in the coming months about what this looks like for them. And they're going to want to, their administrations are going to want to put their flag in the ground for their state and how they think their state should be leading. So I am concerned, I think we should be concerned about the potential shifts that might come from these gubernatorial elections. I think there's two main things that state policymakers need to be really thinking about, sort of rooted in messaging. One, we need to be very clear of what are we measuring, and then how is that being calculated? And then how do we take what we're measuring, how we're calculating it, and how do we convey it to the lay people, to parents? How do they identify with if this quality school? How these indicators, chronic absenteeism obviously is one of the most common indicators across the states. How do they come together, assemble, combine, and sort of generate a quality sort of, is this a good school, is this not a good school? How do we as consumers understand all of this? So I think the messaging is going to be critical, and I think state policymakers, it's going to be impendent on them to really lead, to make sure they are able to articulate with some clarity what and if this school or these indicators, are we moving in the right direction? The last thing I'll say is the thing that should probably concern a lot of us, and I know my colleagues on this stage have been strong advocates for equity, is we don't want to be, as the pendulum shifts and autonomy is coming back to states, that it doesn't shift all the way back to a time where, I think Ann mentioned soft bigotry or low expectations, to a time where we didn't have high expectations for all students. So I want to be really careful that we as policymakers, folks that influence policymakers, that we're reminding our folks that it is critical that all students should be afforded an opportunity to define success. We got to be clear what success looks like. So it's going to be an interesting next 6 months and interesting next couple of years. Thank you for the question.
All right. Ajit, next question is for you.
Sure.
Can you talk about the implications for state and district leaders of broadening accountability systems to include these multiple measures?
Sure.
Has it changed things for you at the SEA?
Great, thank you. And thanks again, Jay and Ann, for this opportunity to represent Connecticut's work. Just to give a little background on our accountability system before I talk about the implications, we started changing our accountability system in Connecticut for schools and districts well prior to ESSA as part of ESEA flexibility. And I think part of the way we thought about our accountability system was really driven by our board's commitment, our state board's commitment to both equity and excellence. So the equity aspect remains, in my mind, very strong in our work. And there were really three big buckets, if you will, that were the for our state board's goals, and they had to do with academic achievement and gap closure, college and career readiness, and ensuring that every student receives a well-rounded education. So those were the real framers through which we actually looked at how could we build an accountability system that was broad enough. It wasn't necessarily, in the ESSA language, we talk about the fifth indicator. We didn't necessarily think of our accountability system as going out and looking for a fifth indicator as much as here's our board's goals for public education. Let's figure out how can we build an accountability system that represents that. And so we have indicators that fall into each of these buckets. We have obviously academic achievement, academic growth. We do have chronic absenteeism from an engagement standpoint. From a college and career readiness standpoint, we do look at access to coursework. I think you mentioned that, Alyson, in your opening. But we also look at performance on college readiness exams, as well as entrance and post-secondary. I think, Ann, you might have spoken to that as well. And when it comes to well-rounded education, we do look at the arts and fitness, and physical fitness. So it might seem like there is a lot of indicators and that we sort of randomly picked these, but we actually didn't randomly pick these. There was actually a state board goal and a vision that actually drove what we were after. And one thing to note is, despite having maybe more indicators than what some other states might have, the weighting, and here's where I think ESSA's guardrails are important, the weighting of these indicators ensure that, for example, at the elementary level, where many of these indicators don't actually come into play, achievement and growth still account for close to 80% of the weight for our schools. So I think it's important to sort of keep that in perspective. Even at the high school level, where we have multiple indicators, when you combine academic achievement, graduation, or our college and career readiness entrance, or college and career readiness assessments, those do account for a big chunk. So having said that, so what are the implications for this? Mm-hmm. I think the main point for me with this sort of broadening is that we recognize that there are multiple dimensions to a student's experience and success in school, and that looking at just one measure of a student on one day doesn't give us that full picture. I think it's important to look at that measure, our standardized measure, but there might be other measures that do need to come into play. And I think that's kind of the sort of thread for us that carries through all of this. And even with that state measure, that it's important for us to, the way we look at it, it's that it's not just a student isn't just a success or a failure. It's not a binary outcome for a kid from our perspective. So we do like to look at these multiple pathways, and what has that done? It's brought in educators, many different educators in the school building and in the district who were never part of accountability conversations in the past. They have been brought to the table and looking and asking about how are kids doing in your world and how can we enrich their experience. And to me, what that has done also is it's expanded the school's sphere of influence. And I talked about this in our lunch prior to this meeting, is that from a chronic absence, for example, students were coming late to kindergarten, for example, because they were taking delays in getting their medical health checkups and immunizations done. And instead of just blaming the indicator, so to speak, or saying that we shouldn't be held accountable for the absences that are, quote, out of our control, we're sort of reframing the discussion to say, hey, how you as a school district, a big player in the community, can actually help your incoming kindergarten class get these things done on time so that they can start school on time. It's really reframing that sphere of influence. When you talked of post-secondary education, for us it was also about, again, not just about it's out of the district's or school's control, but how can that whole notion of summer melt come into play so that students who are accepted but never show up, there are things that the schools or district can do to bridge that gap between public systems. The other implication of this sort of broadening has been the focus more on slightly longer term thinking. And I'll just say slightly, we still have annual assessments, we still hold folks accountable for participation rate. It means a big deal in our system, but instead of just looking for the next year's quick fix to get a quick boost in scores, now they're feeling that districts and schools have the permission to say, how can I put in place stuff that actually benefits our curriculum and our instruction for a slightly longer term. So our interim milestones under ESSA are over 3 years. We have annual milestones as well that we look at with some of our lowest performing districts and schools, but when it comes to sort of our state plan, we've put in 3-year milestones to sort of, again, give that slightly longer term thinking. The last couple of things I'll mention have to do with data quality. When you look at multiple measures like this, it draws attention to data quality on all those measures. And let me tell you, if we think schools were tracking attendance accurately and perfectly, we have learned stuff because we've been doing chronic absence not just as an accountability indicator, but really public reporting, the little a aspect of accountability for many years. And we continue to work at this with schools. It's never a done deal. And what it's also shown us is that we need to have policies to really clarify what does it mean for a student to be in attendance? How do you handle a kid who goes for a doctor's appointment for a couple of hours and then comes back? How is that actually recorded in your systems? So I think data quality across the board has been important and has been good, because if you want to run a good school system and you want to be good administrators and stewards of our students, you got to have a handle on your data. And all this, these multiple indicators broadening the dimensions of a student and what it means to be a public school student has allowed other aspects of the agency, the SEA in my case, to really rally behind those indicators, rally their work behind those indicators. So our school counselors are connected to our graduation and on-track indicators. That's part of their strategic goals for our state board. Our Office of Student Supports looks at the chronic absenteeism indicator when they report to the state board. So I think it's really given different aspects of our agency the opportunity to connect to our accountability system in ways that they didn't before. So I hope that gives a perspective, and I hope I didn't go too long.
No, you're fine, and we'll be able to dig more deeply into those issues in a bit. Mr. Johnson, we've heard a lot about chronic absenteeism, obviously one of the most popular indicators. You're someone who works in communities. What can communities do now that we're identifying this as a problem to actually help solve it and address it?
Well, thank you, and I've made my name pretty easy to pronounce, huh?
You did, yeah.
And thank you very much for the shout out to MBK San Antonio. There are MBK communities across the country. In fact, there are 250 MBK communities. Some are really far ahead on the curve in terms of the work being done, and San Antonio is among them. So thanks for that mention of San Antonio. So when I think of this issue, though, there are two pictures that I have in mind. One is I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and so I noticed that Baltimore is, of course, one of the cities as part of the work that you all are doing through the Bush Institute. And if you were to, I know it's not to pick on my hometown, because I know my hometown's trying to do a lot to address some very difficult issues. But if you were to drive to Baltimore on any given day, you'd see lots of kids who clearly are absent from school because of how young they are, and these kids are probably chronically absent from school. There's nothing more heartbreaking than to see 11, 12-year-old kids who are just hanging out in the street in the middle of the day. So we have got to address this, and I think the fact that this is an indicator in so many schools in so many states is just critical. And then there's like the flip side, the very positive side of it. I remember we did an event here in D.C. at an elementary school celebrating kids who were first and second graders for turning around their attendance rates in school. And they got certificates. And like these really cute, although they were snotty-nosed, it was February, so they were like this kind of like, so you're like handing them their certificate and like, oh, that's okay, I won't. But the fact that there was an incentive and their parents were there for coming to school and being where they needed to be and where everyone knows they need to be was so important. And so that's an incredible value for these children to be and their families to be where it is that they need to be. Let me just first start off with respect to My Brother's Keeper by saying clearly where it is now. My Brother's Keeper, of course, the task force that I had the distinct honor of being able to be the chair of in the White House, we did it for the last 3 years of the Obama administration. But there was also a parallel effort, and that was the My Brother's Keeper Alliance that was started by business leaders in 2015 to mirror the work that we were doing in the White House. The My Brother's Keeper Alliance is now a centerpiece, really, of work that's being done out of the Obama Foundation, because as President Obama said many, many times, this is work that will be important to him for the rest of his life. Now, when we went to him, though, to say, well, Mr. President, what would you like MBK in your post-presidency world to focus on? He said, we obviously can't do all the things we did in the White House with all these federal agencies, so I want us to focus on some things we can do very well from the beginning. And those need to be around mentorship, because we know there are millions of children in this country, especially boys and young men of color, growing out without their dads who need men in their lives, positive male figures in their lives. So let's focus on that and reward that and create incentives for that. And second is around violence reduction. The president, through his own experiences in his own life, growing out without his father, sees that it's so important that especially young men of color have positive male role models. And so that became part of what he did in the White House with MBK, but is central now. So when we, back in 2015 and 16, were looking at this issue, though, of chronic absenteeism, we brought Professor Balfance in and others who had done research on the importance of mentors as a way to address chronic absenteeism. And from that, we built the Success Mentors model to try to get 1 million adult mentors to agree to volunteer to work with kids who were either chronically absent or at great risk of being chronically absent. And so, again, understanding that a mentor can even intervene in this area. It's not just sort of amorphous mentoring, which a lot of times is just important to have an adult around, but to be really focused on kids, again, who there are lots of reasons, as you all have done the research and the data about why children become chronically absent. But to have an adult that this young person, the family, can trust to get to the heart of the issues, whether it's about poverty, whether it's about being bullied in school, whether it's a host of factors, a kid perhaps not feeling ready to go to school, or even things around trauma. So mentoring and chronic absenteeism have been linked to the work of My Brother's Keeper going back to when we were in the White House. It is an important piece of the work as we go forward, as we are examining and making grants to communities based in MBK communities throughout the country. I know there are many school districts that continue to work around this Success Mentors model, and we want to continue to see that build out, and again, because it will be tied to the kinds of support that comes from the Obama Foundation. So that's our view of chronic absenteeism and my own personal views of it as well. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Superintendent Brabrand, can you take us to the district level here? How is Fairfax reimagining your curriculum beyond math and reading to accelerate student success for college and career readiness?
Well, thanks for letting me be here. It's wonderful to be here as a superintendent. I feel like I'm the luckiest superintendent in the nation, because if I had all these thought leaders, all these policymakers around right now, there isn't any problem we couldn't solve. And I do think the rubber hits the road in school districts to be able to implement the vision of No Child Left Behind and now of ESSA. A lot of the focus really gets to outcomes. We all want to see a great quality education for kids. And now we're having this discussion about indicators and what indicators states will pick, chronic absenteeism or school culture. But a lot of it, I think, is looking at the inputs. We need a high-quality teacher in every classroom. We need a high-quality principal leading that group of teachers. But we also need a strong, viable curriculum that's based on 21st century skills. I'm proud to be in a school district that I actually started in. I was a career switcher, a business person who changed my career to come into education, and Fairfax has taken the lead with what we call Portrait of a Graduate. What are those attributes that we want to have embedded in the curriculum that all kids need to be able to know and be able to do around creativity, citizenship, being resilient and goal-directed, communication, critical thinking, being a global and ethical thinker. We've got to embed those in the curriculum so that our great teachers can really be sharing great curriculum. I actually think one of the issues for achievement gaps that have so long plagued this country are really access and opportunity gaps, and they're access and opportunity gaps to good curriculum. The work Fairfax County has done as a school district around this curriculum, and it's so great to go in and watch. We've redesigned our science curriculum at elementary school from worksheets to labs. When you're a third or fourth grader and you're getting to do a science lab and doing DNA, that's a lot different than reading about it in a workbook or writing the words DNA on a worksheet. So we've really got to, curriculum is an opportunity to really help us address these access and opportunity gaps for students. The work we did as a district was so powerful, it really informed the state of Virginia in doing their redesign, and they have Portrait of a Graduate now at the state level. So I think as we keep talking about ESSA, how district work can actually start to inform state work. We've been going a little bit the other way, where the federal to the state and the state to the district. I think we really have an opportunity in Fairfax, along with other school districts, are helping lead the way that the district work, the practitioner work, can inform state and federal policymakers. And I'm hopeful we can have more discussions. There need to be more superintendents at the table. There need to be more institutions like you all at the table. There need to be more policymakers at the table really helping solve these problems. And I think if we really put our heads together and bring everyone to the table, we can do more of it. And I'm proud of what Fairfax County is doing. We have more to do. And we're really starting to expand the curriculum, the training for it, the assessments for it, kids doing capstone projects at elementary, middle, and high school, more performance-based assessments, different from a standardized test. But I got to tell you, we asked our business community in Virginia, top 20 things they want employers. The standardized content test information they were interested in was only one thing out of the top 20, and it was for math. All the other 19 things were more Portrait of a Graduate attributes. Final thing, just because it was a couple of questions, I believe chronic absenteeism, attendance is a habit, and you start seeing it at elementary school. It's not just a habit about a kid. Sometimes it's a habit about our adults. So we've really got to work on our marketing, not just to look at the kid level or the school level, but what are we saying to parents and communities about attendance and showing up, right? 99% of life is showing up. How to build that habit of showing up in our young people right from the beginning when they walk through our schoolhouse doors.
All right, thank you for that. Ms. Diodonet, so obviously you're also seeing this from a school level.
Correct.
Can you talk about what district administrators can really do to support combating chronic absenteeism? Especially how can climate, culture, and parental involvement, how can those things be employed to tackle this problem?
Okay, certainly. Thank you, Anne, for having me here, and Ms. Pixford for inviting me to this institute. So if he's the luckiest superintendent in the nation, I'm the luckiest assistant superintendent in the nation. So I think we have to go back to what Jay had mentioned in terms of what gets measured gets done, right? And so in Paterson, the way we got involved with chronic absenteeism, the Children's Aid Society that we work with our full-service community schools, gave us a list and said, you have 176 students that are chronically absent. We were like, what's that, right? What are you talking about? We have like a 92% daily average attendance rate. And so they came in and did a workshop. On top of that, the state was talking about reducing our funds by $16 million because of attendance. And so I was like, I was a school principal at the time, and I was like, $16 million, we're already underfunded. If you tried to take $16 million from the district, my kids are really gonna be at a disadvantage. And so we began that work. And I think that paying attention to the numbers and really having a commitment to them and having that R word, the relationship with parents, and walking and talking to them, that to me was like the game changer, was when you see Miss Santana say, Miss Santana, you know, I'm gonna say Jay's been absent 3 times this month, how can I help you? And really becoming familiar and personal with them, or, you know, he's been late 6 times. How can I help you? And so that, I think, starts the work with chronic absenteeism and really knowing your students. From a district level, and that's a school level, right? In New Jersey, we now have a new teacher evaluation system where teachers were really getting sort of nervous. They needed some leadership position. So we used what we had sort of as a tool. Oh, you need some leadership skills and points. We need some success mentors, and that really helped our numbers go down. And it was a 76% reduction when we did this trial in chronic absenteeism. And so from that, you know, they asked you to present to the board. I presented to the board, and all of a sudden I became like the attendance person for not only for Paterson, but for the state, right? And so, you know, but it was good work, right? Because in my mind, if they come to school, then there's going to be some learning going on, and we should see student achievement rates go up. And so that became sort of our walk. We did tremendous work, and then it started sort of people getting on board, and they call me Dio because of my last name. Dio, how do you do that? Dio, can we come see? And so obviously, yes, come. And so we introduced, you know, the attendance review committees where you actually have agendas with kids. These are our at-risk students. This kid has been absent 5 days. Why? And so we assigned success mentors to them. And we wanted teachers that had no relationship with them, so that way it's not like a fear factor. It's more of like, I want to get to know you, and I really want to do what's in your best interest. So that became a game changer as well, because we did see kids coming to school more. Then the superintendent picked chronic absenteeism as one of her goals. And so when it's the superintendent's goal, it's everybody's goal, right? And so now, including the whole cabinet. So now it's not just Dio and her chronic absenteeism work, right? Now it's everybody. And so we now have banners across the districts where we partnered with our freeholders and our city council members. So in all 6 of our wards, we have big attendance banners that say attendance matters. And then we say, if you miss 5.5, if you miss 10 days of school, you've essentially missed like 55 hours of instruction, and really showing that not coming to school is not, you know, you're missing 2 days, you're missing, you know, essentially 11 hours of instruction. And so if you don't come to school, you're missing a lot of time with that teacher contact. We also, whenever there's a board meeting, an assembly, we always talk about chronic absenteeism. When teachers have one-on-one meetings, they have to talk about attendance. When you come to the district office to complain about anybody, our Family and Community Service writes down at the top how many days absent the child has, so that when they meet with anybody at the cabinet, we go, did you know that your child has been absent 17 times? And we go into that work with them. We also made sure that all of our schools have it inserted in their school improvement plans. We have changed our policy, so everybody's attendance, and you talked about data integrity, sort of making sure that that's work. We had to change our procedures because, you know, teachers inputted their attendance at 2 o'clock, others at 9. It wasn't uniform. So now by 9 o'clock in Paterson Public Schools, everybody's attendance must be taken. So it's not, anything crazy for Dio to call and say, why isn't that lady's attendance in there, right? Because what gets monitored gets done. And so we've seen a great change in that. In terms of PBSIS in our schools, that has helped a tremendous amount. We've invited parents to come to assemblies for most improved attendance, and we've seen that has changed things around. We have a hashtag, which is PPS Show Up. We have T-shirts. So just getting everybody involved. The funniest thing is when you talk to a parent and you suspend a child, they say, and you want our kids to come to school, but you're talking about chronic absenteeism, but you're suspending my kid. That means that people are listening to us. But I also, right, when they start arguing back, and I'm like, thank you so much. I'm so happy that you know about chronic absenteeism, right? And again, it's relationships and how you treat your parents, because you talk about climate and culture. Just telling them the benefits of them coming to school. The conversation that now is happening in terms of climates, we talk about parents, and I'm sort of bold with this big green here, right, with everybody else. It's not uncommon for me to tell teachers, like, your attendance is horrible. How do you want our kids' attendance to get better? So I think changing the conversation to, if a kid misses 5 days of instruction and you're out for 5 days because you need a mental break, right? That's a lot of instructional hours that our children are missing, and really being candid with teachers and administrators to say, everybody has to hashtag show up, right? Because attendance matters. And I think that has made a difference, especially in one of my smaller schools where the principal has really embraced this work. And, she just the other day, she was like, Dio, I can't tell you how much the teachers' attendance has improved because I really was candid with them and told them. So I think having those conversations is really, really important, and really changing the teacher practice in the classroom. If you're a boring teacher, I do not want to go to your classroom, right? If you're not giving me rigorous work, or if you're not having high expectations of me, I don't want to come to school. I'm bored. So that is also very important. If the walls on your, I think I talked to you, Ann, about that. If your walls are dirty and there's garbage on the floor, I don't want to come to school because you don't care about me, right? And so everybody has to be involved in this work. I'm going to stop here because I could just keep going. I could keep going, but at the end of the day, it's really about relationship and commitment and really following through. The last thing I can say, though, which is really necessary, is for the district level to make sure that when they issue data that they talk about it, and to make sure, what is the problem here, that they analyze it. We had, for the 100th day of school, we had a 100% day, 100th day of school, 100% day. So we encouraged everybody to really come to school. We wanted 100% attendance. And you would be surprised, like the schools that are really chronically absent at 44% at the end of the year, how their attendance increased. So it's all about motivating and that commitment to the work. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was great. So we talked about the many, many, many measures that states could have chosen, right? They could have chosen student engagement, climate surveys. One person joked that they could choose hugs. So our chronic absenteeism and college and career readiness, they were obviously the most popular indicators. Were they the right ones? Did states miss the boat here? And that can go to anybody. And I know you're looking at a lot more in Connecticut than just those two things. But especially for our district superintendents, do you think your states are focusing on the right things?
Oh, my. Is this being recorded?
I think maybe.
I think there was a lot of discussion at the state level, and even among superintendents, is chronic absenteeism the right additional factor? There was some interest, honestly, around the school culture. Mm-hmm. And doing the dipsticking of that, and several school districts are doing work around looking at the culture of a school, kind of the why. Why is a kid wanting to come to school? And in some ways, it's the flip side of the coin for chronic attendance, right? You may be able to find out schools with chronic attendance. Why are those kids? And that's part of the data review. Why are kids not coming? Is it for health reasons? Is it for parental support or lack thereof at home for getting that habit of going to school? Or is it also about what's in school that entices me to come? An exciting curriculum, a teacher who's building a relationship with me, a school that provides opportunities not only in the classroom but outside the classroom for extracurricular and co-curricular activities to excel. I think time will tell. I am not sure no one indicator is the silver bullet in education. So I don't think this is the new silver bullet. But I do think it may help us look at some things a little differently and move away from just test scores as the only thing to unpack, to look and find a deeper story, a deeper narrative. Because as you start to look at schools, I mean, Jay shared of those schools, so many 15 years of chronic absenteeism. Yeah. What's really going on in that school and in that community? And it's something deeper than test scores. So I think it may be able to help us start the journey. I don't think it's the endpoint indicator.
So I'm just going to add to that. I think there's something to be said about the fact that we're already collecting the data. And as Jay mentioned, there's 15 years. I think the fact that 15 years is now going to be associated with a school report card or some type of, however the state's reported out on their accountability, that's going to shine a light. So school leaders, superintendents are going to have to sort of reconcile that with their communities. How have you sat back for 15 years and not addressed this problem? I think Sandra's point about this, when she's talking about suspensions, I think there is a push and pull here, because we actually see in schools that have chronic absenteeism, we also see high suspension rates. And so, we actually have Secretary King coming in next week to speak with Virginia legislators about this idea of disproportionate suspension rates. So it's going to help you sort of square that also. Like, we're saying we want to have kids in school, we want to address this, but we're overly suspending, and we're overly suspending students of color. So restorative practices, I know Fairfax is doing great work in this. I think other districts, it's going to compel them to start thinking differently about the way they engage students in regards to the discipline, because they're going to have to they can't be speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They're going to, again, have to reconcile that. I think the college and career piece of all of this, and my former boss, Secretary of Education, Laura Fornash, and when the McDonald administration, she put this, it's something we put in place, is requiring for students a CTE, some type of credential. Now, what unfortunately came out of that is it became you started seeing some schools just push kids into some workforce or work keys assessments just to give them something, the certificate. Since then, obviously, with Lumina's great research and great work, we've obviously put a lot more emphasis on high quality. So when kids come out, I think that's what Scott's point was. When they leave his door and they go out into the community, are they equipped with something? And I think having college and career, especially the career piece of that, as an indicator is going to really change some behaviors. Now, how that aligns to post-secondary universities, I think there's still an opportunity that needs to be. I don't think there's one state that's really out there crushing that. Yeah. So I think that's going to be an area that we could address out as states. But again, I think those are great indicators. I think there's definitely something to be said about the fact that data is there. So I don't want to minimize the fact that, as somebody said over lunch, maybe some states were found an easier path forward. Nevertheless, it is really rich data that, once reported, it could really at least change some behaviors.
Yeah, I would agree with that, in that there is a data collection burden if you try to add a whole bunch of new things, and I think the district folks will attest. If we were to, from the state perspective, add one more thing that they had to collect and submit to the department, I'm not sure they would be happy about us necessarily going down that direction. So part of our commitment when we redesigned our accountability system was to make use of the data we were already collecting. Because if we're not making use of it, why collect it? Mm-hmm. So I think that was kind of our commitment. And but to go back to your question about our college and career readiness and chronic absenteeism, the right indicators at this point, I think they're good indicators, and I think for our first salvo at a multiple measures system, I don't think they're a bad place to start at all, considering the fact that it is readily available. I do think that part of the decisions that went into our selection of indicators was balancing big A, little a, sort of a formal accountability system versus just mileage that you can get from visible public reporting. So, for example, we do not include suspensions and expulsions in our formal accountability system. And we actually had several discussions around this, but we have so much press and attention that we draw to our discipline data that includes disaggregations by every subgroup, boys of color, early grades, pre-K through 2, et cetera, that we have drawn so much attention to that issue that we didn't almost want to create a disincentive of, I think they were talking about, massaging the data or falsifying data, if you put it bluntly. We didn't want to sort of push that. We wanted the data to be clean and really draw attention to it. And it has caused legislative change in our state, including prohibition on pre-K through 2 out-of-school suspensions, except in very rare cases. And so it has actually we've reached out to individual schools that have had higher numbers of pre-K through 2 suspensions and really taken action on that, because it starts early. These types of behaviors and things start early. And the one last point is balancing between leading and lagging indicators. I think when you're dealing with college and career readiness, there's not just one thing. So I think when we looked at, so we include on track to high school graduation, the Chicago School Consortium research approach. And we did that because 9th grade was such a strong predictor, on trackness in 9th grade was such a strong predictor of high school graduation that we wanted to balance a leading indicator with post-secondary entrance, which is a lagging indicator. So I think you try to sort of balance those different types of indicators when you're trying to put an accountability system like this together.
I was just going to say that the fact that we have close to 7 million children who are chronically absent, that to me certainly argues for it being a leading indicator, particularly since it's such a threshold issue. Like, we are not going to improve education for children across this country if 7 million kids on any given day are chronically absent. The impact of chronic absenteeism on children of color is, of course, profound. It's one of those cases where the disparities are heartbreaking, and they are grave in many situations, where almost 25% of African American, or 25% of chronically absent kids are African American kids. So that's a huge problem in terms of equity. And speaking for myself, and this is not a policy position of the Obama administration, but I can sort of guess where, or the Obama Foundation, where people would be on this. This issue of rethinking discipline and the fact that it is now being reconsidered when we're also talking about chronic absenteeism. Like, we can't address chronic absenteeism if we're having, as the numbers now indicate, a greater disparity growing in terms of young people of color being suspended or expelled or otherwise disciplined in school. So let's not be illogical about this, I would say, to some folks who hopefully are listening.
Yeah.
In Paterson, we also have a K-2 no suspension rule, and that has also brought the conversation to the table. Are you suspending this child really for chewing gum and not listening to you, or for walking out of class? So that has reduced the number, because when we talk about chronic absenteeism, an absence is an absence is an absence. So I think that is also, administrators are also really looking at things differently and saying, if I suspend him, I'm going to jack up my chronic absenteeism rate, right? So they're having those internal conversations with themselves. And so at the same time, from the district level, we're saying, you're actually should put in some counseling into this. So more of some remedies to help these children, because some of them, the stories, and I know you shared about a kid not having oil in his house, and that's why he wasn't coming to school. But that strict uniform policy of, oh, so you don't have your uniform on today, I'm going to give you a 2-day suspension. Well, how about my mother doesn't have money to wash clothes? Or how about, why do I have to wear a uniform to learn, right? If we're doing well here. And so that kind of changes the mindset of people. And I do see, because I have to sign every month those suspension reports, I do see a decline in suspension, but one has to think, is it because we're jacking up your chronic absenteeism rate, or because we're really rethinking discipline the way we should?
Just to connect the dots to this issue of chronic absenteeism and discipline, I think historically school districts have had a legal approach to discipline, and a legal approach to chronic absenteeism. I mean, obviously a truant kid, both places take you through the legal system. Mm-hmm. I think you're seeing a school district recognition of, we got to move away from a legal approach to a social-emotional approach. Restorative justice works. We have 7 folks now dedicated, and I need 700. And we need states and policymakers to start to say it's just as important to have a school psychologist or a social worker in a school as it is to have a great classroom teacher. Some of the academic challenges that school districts and students are facing, behind that are social emotional challenges or trauma-informed conditions that we have to deal with. And so I do think in the end, this work around discipline and the work around chronic absenteeism will see us move away from legal remedies to what I think are going to be more social justice, restorative justice, social emotional support remedies to help kids get where they need to get in terms of their social emotional conditions, and then they'll be able to flourish academically, and we'll see improvement on those traditional core academic indicators.
Yeah, I hear that. So when ESSA first passed and these new indicators came, I heard from some folks, hey, these indicators aren't necessarily going to pinpoint new schools that need help. We're going to see the same bottom performers because if you have low test scores, you're also not going to have high AP class taking. You're going to have high chronic absenteeism. So what do you think about that? I mean, if accountability systems exist to figure out which schools that need help, do you worry that these measures aren't really going to make a difference? Schools with low academics are going to do poorly on these measures too.
Well, I'll go back to what Jay reminded us of, this idea of measuring. What gets measured gets done. Okay. The worst case scenario is that you'll start seeing schools that will start setting aspirational goals for their students. We got to get more kids enrolled in AP, dual enrollment, and IB courses. That's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. We as policymakers, we should be thinking and being concerned with, are those students, those underrepresented populations, are they finding success in those classes? But you're going to certainly see a spike in some enrollment of some of those advanced courses. So I think in that regard, it's going to be a good thing. The support structures that have to be put in place, I think state leaders, not to beat up on state lawmakers, but the funding, there has to be some requisite funding that will come with that, because there are going to have to be some additional supports that will have to go on, and especially in some of these schools that have been these so-called sort of bottom 5% focus schools, however we identify them in each state, because you can't move that school that's having academic challenges into having dramatic increases in enrollment in those college advanced types of coursework.
We also have like 90 schools, right? Mm-hmm. So 90% of the children free and reduced lunch, 90% in attendance, but 90% with achievement gaps. So I think it starts and ends with leadership. Sometimes, like district level folk have to say, this principal is not cutting it. We need to get him either another career or get him on a corrective or get her on a corrective action plan and keep it moving, because at the end of the day, the ones that are suffering are the children, right? And again, we talk about opportunity gaps and expectation gaps. So if we just keep saying the same ones are moving out, are going to stay the same, and we're just going to start going back and forth. There are real decisions that need to be made at the district level regarding who's in charge, because there are such things as turnaround schools that do well, and it's because of leadership. So I think we have to also do that hard work of having those fierce conversations, right? And saying, you're not cutting it, bud. Let's talk.
Yeah.
You also want to take a crack at that?
To your question of the same schools getting re-identified, maybe so.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the lowest 5% of schools, maybe that's true. But what we are seeing, though, is when you focus on so many different measures which are not just one test, one achievement measure, but measures of engagement and college readiness and career readiness and so on, that there are students, and we say students of color, poor students from low-income families, our most vulnerable populations, they actually exist in not just the 90 schools. They exist in many schools across the state. And when you focus on more of these types of engagement indicators, we find that it actually draws the attention of those schools to figure out why are these, maybe it was on assessment, on achievement, we saw it, but now they're showing up on multiple measures, and our overall school score no longer is high enough because you're getting pulled down, so to speak, on more indicators. Now I better pay attention to the students who are not doing well in my school. So I think it's actually helped to highlight our, again, I'll say vulnerable students who exist in many schools throughout the state.
All right, thank you.
I just really appreciate the answers they gave.
Yeah, no, I do
That's
too.
really good. That's really important. Thanks.
We got some great questions from the audience, so I'll start reading through those. One person is noting that the health sector is starting to pay a lot more attention to health-related social needs, which is obviously something schools are looking at too. So they want to know what can be done to engage or scale up existing education health collaboration on things like chronic absenteeism.
Can I talk about that?
Absolutely, that sounds right up your alley.
Full service community schools is what we have in Paterson. We have about 7 of them, where we have a health clinic within the building. And so when you talk about not having your shots, that's an easy one. Come with me, the doctor's here on Thursday, right? Come in and we can fill this out. There's grants just in case they don't have insurance. The other thing is our asthmatic children, right? Our asthmatic children, you take them out on a fire drill, they get that cold air. They're not coming to school for 4 or 5 days. And I actually had a call last week where the lady said, Miss Diodonet, you're always talking about attendance. They're taking my baby outside in this cold weather. And now I have to take her to the doctor. And now you're going to mark her absent. It was like this whole thing. And I was like, Miss Gonzalez, you are absolutely correct in terms of what we can do as educators. And I told her, unless there's a fire or, God forbid, a shooter, we know when these fire drills are going to occur. In an urban school, there is a bodega in every 3 in 1 corner, right? When I was the principal of School 5, I went across the street. They loved giving me free sandwiches. I had a relationship with them. And basically, when I had to do fire drills, my nurse would gather her kids. She would walk them across the street for that fire drill. And it was a done deal, right? They didn't have to suffer from asthma because and my husband's asthmatic, so one cold air could really knock you out. In terms of having workshops for parents, having that connection with, I'm going to say St. Joseph's Hospital, which is our big hospital, having connections and relationships with the hospital is another way. It's really about relationships and planning well. And that can really take a lot of that away, of those health issues. Now, the children who have cancer, God forbid, and all that, that's a whole different, you talked about those serious diseases, that's a whole different story. But the ones that we could prevent, those are easy fix in terms of just planning.
I've thought about this in the context of some work that I've also been doing around awareness about the impact of sickle cell disease. And that's particularly pernicious in African-American communities. And there's such shame and misunderstanding, of course, around sickle cell disease and how episodic it is. And I would think that for a child who has sickle cell disease, chronic absenteeism is really pretty close to the line for them. Yeah. When we did our event, by the way, the one with the cute but runny-nosed kids, we actually had not only Secretary King at the time from the Department of Education, but we also had Secretary Castro there from HHS, again, to emphasize how these two issues, health and education, go hand in hand.
I think the work she talked about, community centers and schools, huge. Lots of school districts aren't there yet. That's something our district is taking a deeper dive. One of the groups missing out here is the city or county government municipality in their policies. I am proud Fairfax County School Board and the Board of Supervisors this year decided to create a One Fairfax, an equity policy that will shine across all government services, all school services, an equity lens on everything that's delivered to kids, to families, to citizens and residents. And I think this is one, again, where are we doing the wraparound services necessary to help kids? Jeffrey Canada, if you read the book, What It Takes, Paul Tough, I think he found in Harlem 50 to 60% of the absenteeism was around asthmatic kids who just needed the right medicine. I left a smaller school district in Virginia where access to health was a huge issue. And finally, the local hospital was saying they put $7 million into building a community center in the neighborhood where it was needed. There was a medicine desert. Just like food deserts, there was a medicine desert. No access to the health care needed. Everybody was making the trip in a taxi to the emergency room. So we're not as far along in that holistic thinking. It's not just the child. In many cases, it's the family. And we've got to pull both of those together in a more systematic fashion. So I think health is getting it. One of the things we're doing, too, is we're looking at our curriculum around health, healthy life choices for kids, and beginning a continuum in our health and physical education to build that in more. We're redesigning our food delivery. We're putting salad bars in all of our 100 elementary schools. 200 schools, we're putting salad bars. Salad bars. I just went in last Friday. The kids are going nuts, filling up their plates with corn and carrots. But before, it was pizza, it was cheese pizza and French fries. So it sounds silly, but again, and we market it as something exciting and fresh and new. By the way, after I went to the salad bar, I could still go on the line and get my cheese pizza slice. But we put up front the good stuff. And I think putting up front the good stuff, good curriculum for kids, good access to health care for kids, if we give every kid the same access and same opportunity, we're going to see those achievement gaps narrow, and we're going to see the academic indicators improve.
If I just say one thing, I think also for parents who have sickly children, knowing that they could have home instruction, come to the home for 2 or 3 hours to receive instruction each day is also important, because sometimes parents don't have that information, and because of a health issue, they also miss out on their academics, and then that they're really chronically absent, because sometimes states code them differently, and so a kid that's sick but is still receiving instruction would be a kid on home instruction and not necessarily chronically absent. So that's important for parents to know.
This is a good question for the state and district leaders we have up here. How are states and districts supporting schools to implement these new school quality indicators that we have under ESSA? What are you doing for your schools? We've heard a lot about it, but
I'm getting $84,000, so
okay.
I mean, $84,000, and right now she's trying to get me 20 attendance officers, but I'd rather not have 20. I'd rather have 4 that are solid and get more monies so that we can have more programming. However, when you're under budgeted, and we're for the past 7 years in total, we've been under budgeted $280 million. That becomes a problem. But that's a whole different panel discussion. But the fact that this year we were able to make decrease chronic absenteeism, I think in the month of December, the district went down 44% in chronic absenteeism when compared to the year before. With no money, I'm hoping that this $84,000 will make larger gains and decrease it more. So,
I think from the state perspective, I think some of it is definitely need for additional resources. In Connecticut, we have something we call an Alliance District program, and it is intentionally not phrased as low-performing district program or a failing district program. It is our lowest performing districts, but we call it an alliance because it is a partnership between the state and the local district. And over the past 5 years, we have invested over $500 million in these 30 districts, 30 of our lowest performing districts. For Connecticut, where you can drive through in 2 hours, we have almost 200 school districts. So that's Connecticut. But we've invested over $500 million in these districts, and several of them have invested those resources into supports and engagement opportunities for students. So I think there's been direct cash investment. We also have something we call a Commissioners Network school. That's a school level thing where I think we currently have maybe 16 schools that apply to be part of the Commissioners Network, and they get additional resources and supports. But these resources and supports aside, I think what you've heard here is that, and from some of your openings, is that there are, I'll say, low cost to no cost strategies that can be implemented to really make a big difference on some of these indicators that we're talking about. I mean, the two-way texting, I think there is actually some pretty rigorous evidence that shows that actually does make a difference. And some of those studies just came out recently as it pertains to chronic absenteeism. There are also studies like that when it comes to summer melt and students engaging and following through and enrolling in post-secondary. So there are steps that districts and schools can take. And this is what I mean by sphere of influence. There are things they can do to expand that sphere and really view themselves much more as a community, school community organization than just a reading and math, that's all we do and that's it kind of perspective. So I think that's there are ways in which you can really extend this from a school district perspective.
Biggest thing we're doing right now for our schools, we're giving a real-time, we've taken all the ESSA indicators for testing, chronic absenteeism, and we have a real-time database now that we're about to put out to the school principals so they can keep tracking. Even as the testing starts, and we're adding it for the other indicators, they'll know exactly how they're doing, whether they're green, yellow, red, instead of waiting for the state timeline, here it comes, and a chance to be more proactive, to know your own data. And before we were doing we didn't want to wait for the state, so we had people crunching it at each school. Now we've kind of got that data already done, and you can sort of pull up your iPad or your computer and look at it and spend more time responding to the data than trying to crunch the data in the first place.
If I might add one
Absolutely.
other point, which is, in addition to more resources and low-cost, no-cost strategies, I think we have to stop doing things that we don't need to do anymore that don't add value. And this is a pet peeve of mine. When it comes to testing in particular, non-state testing, there are choices that districts and schools can make that don't need to invest additional resources in tests that do not yield additional information for teachers to actually inform instruction. So I think when you stop doing certain things, you now find time to do other things or invest in other things.
I think that's one thing my former boss stressed, actually, when he kind of surprised many folks in 2015 and came out against the crush of testing that his daughters were facing, but that he knows was happening with millions of kids across the country. Sort of, is this testing really having an impact on how we are measuring how kids are doing, but also on their health and well-being as they navigate their way through school?
I think more money needs to be spent, though, on social-emotional learning at schools, particularly in the low-performing schools. So if we're going to spend money, to battle chronic absenteeism, it should be with those services in mind or those curriculums.
Well, we are just about at time. I have a stack more of questions that I could have asked you all, and I apologize to the audience for not getting to all of them, but I really just want to thank our awesome panel. Thank you so much. Really learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.